Hey everyone, Delph here. Okay, so I already covered the races, I covered the birth signs, and I covered the attributes. So next obviously is the skills. And if you like this video, please consider liking, commenting, or subscribing as it does really help. Thank you. Now, skills are the real substance of Oblivion. Things like racials, birth signs, and attributes can help a lot, but what they really do is help enable your skills in most cases. The criterion are fairly simple. S-tier skills either completely shatter the game, or are simply necessary, at least if you're playing on max difficulty, and there are definitely a few of those, and then it kind of just goes down from there with F tier being essentially useless. Okay, first up is acrobatics. Acrobatics is one of those skills that is very niche, but it can absolutely do stuff for you. You can skip some enemies or areas by simply jumping over certain gaps, and also you can fortify it infinitely and gain more and more jump height that way. At 50 skill, you can also gain a dodge roll that helps you move around a little bit quicker. The main downside to this skill is that it is fairly slow to level. Even jumping everywhere you go, getting to 50 skill is going to take a while, so it isn't the skill I particularly like on that basis. You can also take small amounts of fall damage to increase it as well, and there are known setups for that, but I don't have a setup for it, since it's just not that useful, frankly. Keep in mind, however, that every time you jump, that counts as using acrobatics. So even if you just need to jump a little tiny bit to reach something, you got use out of acrobatics. So you may think it's kind of useless, but it's actually a little tiny bit hard not to use the skill at least once or twice during any given playthrough, in case you get stuck behind a rock or something like that. So while there's not really too much to say about it, other than it's pretty cool, I cannot in good conscience give it a super low rating, although I don't think you should basically ever really take it as a major skill, or go out of your way to use it, but it's also the poster child of a skill that is just good with no downsides, the ability to jump. It is a solid C tier skill, just because of that convenience factor. You could very much beat the game without it, that's for sure, but that ends up being more of a question of why you would beat the game without it as opposed to whether or not you could beat the game without it. Next up is alchemy. Alchemy has a wide variety of things it can do for you, some of which are pretty unique. It can restore health and mana, buff or reduce your stats, make you invisible, increase your defenses, and a wide variety of other niche and useful effects, such as curing disease. It also allows you to make poisons, which not only deal decent damage, but also aren't affected by difficulty. So for max difficulty in particular, this is extremely potent. The downside, of course, being that potions must be crafted, the ingredients must be bought or farmed, and obviously that means knowing where they are, and getting enough of them, which obviously takes time. It is also tied to alchemy equipment. 4 different kinds of items you basically have to be carrying around to make effective potions, and high quality versions of these items can be tough to get your hands on. These downsides are annoying, especially farming ingredients, but it's not so bad if you know exactly what you are looking for and where to go. In spite of this, it has access to basically all of the most broken things in the game: infinite health, magicka, invisibility, and poisons, all of which are ridiculously powerful effects, so I can't give alchemy anything less than S tier. It's very much in the running for the best skill in the game. You could almost beat the entirety of Oblivion with it alone, although there's a handful of undead enemies you do have to kill to beat the game, and they are immune to poison, so you need a workaround of some kind for those, although even a dagger enchanted with weakness to poison would be good enough to kill those enemies, but very much S tier, no doubt about that. Next is Alteration. Alteration can give you bonus armor via shield spells, give you resistance to fire, frost, and shock spells, open locks, help reduce carry weight with feather, and water breathing and water walking. Bonus armor from shield is particularly good, especially for any type of character that is going to be attacked in melee, and opening locks is also really convenient. Feather spells are also really convenient too, as it makes you run faster if you are wearing armor, especially heavy armor. The kicker about all these effects is that many of them are quite cheap actually, and Alteration is a very easy skill to level up as well. So you can just spam spells as you go and fairly quickly get to 100 skill, and then just about any type of character will be able to afford some pretty good spells out of the School of Magic. Now alchemy can give you most of these effects, except for opening locks, and effects like water walking and water breathing are probably better if you get them out of alchemy. But for the rest of these, Alteration is so easy to use that it's more convenient than alchemy if you are planning to consistently rely on just about any of these effects. Very solid skill, and very much helps enable a lot of melee-oriented characters as well, mostly from the bonus armor and feather. I think I can't give it anything less than an A. It's even a great skill just for leveling up really fast, because of how fast it does increase. So if you need to be a certain level for certain enchanted items to appear, for example, Alteration is there for you too. Very good skill. Okay, next is armor, and this allows you to repair your weapons and armor for free, as long as you have repair hammers in your inventory. Obviously very useful if you are using any weapons and armors, and basically required for any character who plans to use anything like that. At 50 skill, you can also repair enchanted weapons and armor, so if you plan on using any of those, at least 50 skill is basically required, and that 50 skill has ended up being the main bottleneck for most of my melee-oriented characters. That's the main downside with the skill. It's not that quick to level up, and even hitting that 50 skill is a pretty significant amount of work. You either have to be constantly repairing every enemy's armor and weapons after you kill them, and or paying for skill training. So most characters don't really get to 75 skill, but at 75 skill, it also allows you to repair armor and weapons to 125%. Good luck getting to that point though, as that is actually a pretty significant amount of work, and very few of my characters have gotten to that point. I'll give it a solid B tier, not because most weapons and armors are even really all that good, but just because it does in fact help enable some really overpowered endgame stuff, and even just some generic low-level stuff as well, so it can kind of be a necessity in many cases. If you want, for example, a suit of armor that makes you immune to spells, and nearly immune to physical attacks, you kinda just have to go with it. Same with super overpowered weapons and that kind of stuff. Very decently useful in a broad sense, but there are a ton of characters that don't need it at all. And really what it does is it just enables strategies that would otherwise be kind of bad without it. Okay, next is athletics. Athletics increases the rate your fatigue regenerates, and also causes you to move faster as you increase it. Now, this is a skill a lot of people would put low on their tier lists, and I do understand why, but in my opinion, that's taking it for granted, because you basically cannot beat Oblivion without athletics, at least at max difficulty. That's because running and swimming increases the skill, and turning running on is literally the first thing I do every time I start a new character. Now, you could probably beat the game without it, but I'm not going to do that, as it would be much slower and a lot more tedious, and probably difficult too. Now the main downside to it is that it is very difficult and slow to level. It's one of the few skills that paying for training is the smartest way to level it, I think, but you don't really have to level it either. And so if you have an extra skill slot for your majors in character creation, you can always just take it to enjoy a little tiny bit of extra move speed and fatigue regeneration. I certainly haven't taken it as a major on most characters, but taking it is also rarely if ever a bad idea either, as long as you have your bases covered, which is more than can be said for some skills. At least you'll always get some value out of it. And like I said, it's a skill I'd hate to not be able to use, because again, it's tied to running. So it's an easy S tier skill, and again, you might balk at that, but you have to understand that any other skill that's an S tier besides athletics, that's how powerful those skills are. In my opinion, you essentially can't beat the game without athletics, and even if you can, you need other S tier skills to make up for the fact that you can't run around, in my opinion. Okay, so putting athletics in S tier is not favoritism or something. That's literally how powerful athletics and the other S tier skills are, that they do that much for you. It's universally essential to basically all Oblivion characters, and trying not to use it would be a challenge in and of itself. Okay, next is Blade. Blade is kind of the poster child for a terrible skill. It doesn't even really do good damage on its own after the tutorial, as enemies like basic Deidre and Undead kind of make a mockery of it. Nevertheless, if you stay level 1 and 2 and level the skill up a lot, it can stay relevant even on max difficulty. You can get the endgame Umbra sword by luring Umbra up to the Imperial City, and that has fixed stats no matter your level, so as long as you have that 50 armor skill required to repair it, you can always do good damage at low levels. You can also get a Daedric Dagger or Claymore by using a glitch with repair to make them last forever. And then you also get the Mehrunes Razor, which is a dagger that has a chance to instantly kill an enemy, so you do in fact have a decent spread of solid weapons at your disposal. On top of that, Blade also enjoys the best weapons for enchantments in daggers. Daggers have short range, but also they are really light and attack faster than any other type of weapon, so you can carry a lot of them around and apply your enchantments really fast. I am tempted to give it somewhere in the D range, but because they have decent unique weapons and are the best targets for enchantments, I think C tier is appropriate. Not necessarily optimal, but also a viable enough skill with solid uses. Next is Block. Block allows you to reduce incoming physical damage from enemies, as long as you have a weapon or shield equipped and are actively blocking. This is actually really great. Being able to reduce damage from enemies is good, and if you have good defenses, it can be a nice bonus. Although grinding it out and timing all your blocks against enemies would be enough of a pain, I don't think it would be foolproof. Not to mention it wouldn't help you against enemy magic. But of course, if you are using a one-handed melee weapon, there's kind of no point in not using it against physical attacks. Shields themselves aren't bad either. They are decent pieces of equipment that come with bonus armor, and there's at least one really good shield that you can get, the Spellbreaker, that comes with 30% spell reflection. Solid B tier skill. Hard to complain about bonus defenses for no real downsides, but very rarely is it insanely broken just on its own. Although, in my understanding, the blocking in the remaster is basically broken. It's totally overpowered. So do keep that in mind, and I'm sure you could grind it out and it would be solid even in the original game. Okay, next is Blunt. Blunt is another melee weapon skill, but it doesn't have any of the advantages that Blade does. It doesn't get Umbra or Mehrunes Razor, and there's no equivalent to the dagger in terms of speed or weight, so it's not a good weapon type for enchantments either, although the one-handed axes are alright. I don't even think blunt weapons stagger any more than blade weapons do, which you sort of think they might. The one advantage is that a Daedric Mace can be obtained even at level 1 with the bound weapons and armor glitch, so that's an option. And that's actually very close in overall quality compared to either Umbra or a Daedric Claymore, so it does even it up just a little tiny bit. Not at all unusable, and you could also totally enchant a blunt weapon as well, and it would be okay, it'd be fine. But that really is kind of the full extent of it. You could also probably make it work out okay just by stacking on a bunch of support magic too, like I've done. Unfortunately, I do have to give it the D rank though. It simply does not have the slight unique advantages that Blade has, but it's decent enough. In this case, D rank is a passing grade, I guess. Next is Conjuration. This is a skill that can summon a wide variety of undead or Daedra allies to fight for you. You do only get one at a time, however, which does include summons from greater powers, so no building an army like you could do in Morrowind. Summoned allies, however, aren't affected by difficulty, so they take 1x damage in combat and then they also deal 1x damage to enemies. So they are in fact a great option for max difficulty, and are one of the most generically useful skills. And even if your summon loses a fight, as long as your character is built for Conjuration, you can just of course always summon another, so a well-prepared character should have little issues with most enemies and areas. The main problem is enemies that heal themselves or have their own summons, as your summons can very easily get bogged down fighting enemy summons and so forth. Although usually if you keep summoning allies, you will eventually be able to wear down most opponents, even if it does take you a while. But this can of course also be a little slow and frustrating to experience as well, so that is a bit of a downside. This does not extend to the final boss, who is actually quite difficult to kill at max difficulty with summons, since he has a bunch of allies around him, his 2 kids, and then also he'll tend to summon as well. So you may need help with that from some other skills, if your character is really high level. If you're low level, you can still kill him with summons, just fine, but if you're high level, not so much. Another downside is enemy AI. Some enemies are designed specifically to target the player and to ignore the player's summons, so it could be a hassle to deal with some opponents for that reason as well, usually quest objective NPCs, and it may be a good idea to add on support magic or alchemy to help offset those situations. With all that being said, if you do stay level 1 and 2, Conjuration can almost make the entire game a joke, although some areas may prove a little tiny bit tricky without the help of greater powers or other skills. I will give it A tier. I think maybe some people think it deserves S tier, but I disagree just a little tiny bit. I think it is so weak in some cases that it probably just doesn't deserve S tier. It's just a tiny bit inconvenient and not entirely self-sufficient. Although the spells themselves are usually cheap enough, you could always use it as a backup or a distraction as well, so that is good. Okay, next is Destruction. Now, generic destruction spells you buy from vendors are pretty poor, although I'm sure you could find a way to make them work if you really wanted to. Mostly when people think about destruction, they of course think of the fact you can stack weakness onto enemies and then one-shot them. You can even enchant weakness effects onto daggers or any other weapon and then attack enemies to death that way. Either way, this has the notable downside that any enemy with spell reflection or spell absorption is going to reflect or absorb the spells, making them less effective. And that's really the major downside. It's somewhat inconsistent against a lot of enemies you don't want to be inconsistent against. Although to be fair, it's more of an annoyance than an actual problem as long as you're willing to save and reload and do stuff like that. And Destruction also enjoys a lot of little other stuff too. You can do things like drain enemy fatigue, or give undead enemies weakness to poison so you can poison them. It's not like you don't have options, and this is one of those skills that potentially rewards you for being very creative. But be aware that it is not strictly self-sufficient, and it also is a bit of a pain to level as well. I'm going to put into A tier. You could build all kinds of characters around Destruction, and it's basically required for some other skills as well. But the downsides are very real, and you may need other skills or specific setups to kind of back it up. Very strong though. but also very much like Conjuration in that it's really, really good, but also does have some really, really strong weaknesses. Next up is Hand to Hand. Hand to Hand is attacking with your fists, and it does have some advantages. Your fists don't have to be repaired, and they do weigh nothing. So that is a very real upside for max difficulty, although it's more convenient than truly useful. It also deals fatigue damage as well as health damage, which means that with enough punching, you can knock enemies down. They do get up pretty quickly though, and it's not something you can really ever rely upon, but maybe it could help in some way with fatigue draining spells or something like that. But if you were going to do something like that, it probably wouldn't really need the extra fatigue damage from hand-to-hand attacks either, so it would be a little superfluous in that case. And so I think that it's not as if that's some secret strategy that hand-to-hand enables, knocking enemies down and punching them to death. It's more like something that hand-to-hand could ride on the coattails of, and that's really what it comes down to. There are a lot of ways to make hand-to-hand work, kind of, but it basically always is going to be outclassed by essentially every other skill in the game. It's a meme above all else and never actually the optimal choice for basically anything ever. Honestly, greater powers are a better source of damage, which is really sad. Absolutely F tier, the worst skill in the game. You can't even use a shield to block while using hand-to-hand, so it doesn't even get the assistance of that. And it very much could have used the boost that blocking would have offered to it. So very tragically poor skill, absolutely F tier, absolutely the worst skill in the game. Okay, next up is Heavy Armor. This actually has a lot going for it. Making yourself resistant to physical attacks is actually pretty nice. And in conjunction with skills like block, you can be surprisingly durable at high or even low levels. Now, it is important to understand that enchantments and alteration can get you to the armor cap of 85 without any armor at all, but getting 1/3 or more of the way there is also a really great start. The downside, obviously, to heavy armor being that it requires a lot of carry weight and slows down your movement, and you have to keep it repaired. But that's the kind of price you have to pay if you want to get attacked by enemies in this game. You can also pretty easily get a really good suit of heavy armor right at level 1, just by luring Umbra up to the Imperial City, and this armor set is equivalent to a full set of Orcish armor for relatively minimal effort. Another cool thing about it is, which I haven't brought up yet, is that leveling up heavy armor gives you a bonus to your endurance stat when you level up. This is also true for block and armor, so these can be really crucial for high-level characters who obviously want a lot of HP. Maxing out endurance fast will translate to a lot of extra health for a character level 15 plus, and can result in being very shockingly durable, especially coupled with high defenses, even at max difficulty. Very much deserves B tier, not perfect or anything like that, but very solid as a rock and can help enable lots of stuff. It is tough to grind out, but endgame armors still have tons of defenses on them anyway, so it does what it does, and it does it well, kind of no matter how much skill you have. The bottleneck is actually the armor skill, really. Okay, next up is Illusion. Now, where do I even start with this? It has Invisibility, Chameleon, and these are like playing with the enemy AI turned off. Enemies don't do anything to stop you or get in your way at all. It's like almost cheating. And you can even add these effects to custom spells. So you can cast a spell that just essentially makes you completely immune to enemies in a lot of ways. Paralysis is another effect that this has. Even 1 second of paralysis stops enemies for a good bit. And it can also be added to custom spells, just like Invisibility. And you can make kind of like mass paralysis spells that'll knock a whole bunch of enemies down at once and stuff like that. It also has command spells, so you can mind control enemies and have them kill each other. This is pretty crazy as well. And you can even enchant a weapon with these command effects. Even 1 second of duration and enemies will still fight each other to the death, because once they've attacked one another, they start infighting sort of like in Doom, and they just keep fighting each other, right? You have Silence as well. That's pretty crazy. It kind of seems weak in comparison to all these other broken things, but it just stops enemy spellcasters from casting extremely dangerous magic, which helps enable all kinds of stuff. Really great for all kinds of enemies, including the final boss. And you could honestly probably eschew magic resistance with this and just have silence effects and just silence anything that's going to cast dangerous spells at you, if you really wanted to. You also have Calm too. This is a spell you can cast to just get enemies to ignore you completely. It's a little expensive for what it is, but again, just another crazy option that you can use if you want to. You also have all kinds of wacky spells for interactions with NPCs as well. You can charm them for disposition to get better prices with merchants or to complete quests and all kinds of stuff like that. And these spells can be set to as low as 1 second duration, and while you're talking to NPCs, time is paused, and so you can basically max out any NPC's disposition forever, basically. And the cherry on top is you can cast Frenzy. And what that does is it gets NPCs to basically go berserk and kill each other. And so you can use this to complete quests and steal NPCs stuff and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. It's also really funny to watch. And to top all of this off, The skill isn't even hard to level. It's actually one of the easier skills in the game to level up really quickly. You can just cast a really basic spell over and over again and have it leveled up within a handful of hours. And the spells are all really cheap too. So with relatively minor preparation and a character that's not even really built around magic, you can get your hands on all of these insanely ridiculous effects. This is, in my opinion, the single strongest skill in Oblivion, bar none. It nearly trivializes the entire game from beginning to end. It's almost like playing with console commands on once you get it going. Now, there will be some enemies that will kind of be a pain to kill, such as the Undead Blades and Sancretor, but you could probably still find a way to do it, and it is very nearly the only skill you need to beat the entire game with, even on max difficulty. Top of S tier, it enables weak characters, and it makes strong characters even stronger. Completely ridiculous. Next up is light armor. Obviously, the main comparison point is between light armor and heavy armor, with light armor weighing you down less, giving you less defenses, and requiring more repair. Unfortunately, a stealth or movement-oriented character probably doesn't really need the defenses at all, but it can help a little tiny bit, I guess. It kind of feels a little superfluous. Either you need your equipment to provide as much defenses as you can get, and you're willing to trade lots of stuff for that, or you don't really need any defenses at all. It does offer roughly the same defenses as heavy armor at really high character levels, and at really high light armor skill, but getting to that point is difficult enough that it's a negligible advantage in my opinion. Another advantage to light armor is that it's on the main easier to repair than heavy armor if your character isn't using armor. Since light armor pieces have lower durability, they cost less for a vendor to repair, and take fewer repair hammers as well, so that is one major upside. Then there are some decent unique light armor pieces out there in the game world. Same with heavy armor, of course, but in the case of light armor, it's the kind of thing that's worth mentioning. There's like a breastplate with like 50 extra magicka on it, which is quite a bit, although it's tough to get. This also includes a set of elven armor you can get your hands on at level 1, which is lighter than Umbra's ebony armor, for not that much less defenses. So I'll give it C tier. Perfectly good skill, but unlikely to make that much of a difference overall, but you can make it work if you just really want to. There are ways. Okay, next is Marksman. This covers bow and arrow damage. Bow damage, like all the other physical damage skills, is kind of poor, but you can do stuff like enchant a bow with command spells to get enemies to fight each other, and do that from a safe distance. Even if the effect only lasts 1 second, it will still work. Like I said in the illusion section, you could stay low level and use the conjured weapon glitch to get a Daedric bow as well, and use that to kite enemies around, and that would probably work too, as long as you stay at low levels. With high sneak, you can also sneak attack with it as well pretty consistently, and probably create scenarios where enemies don't even know that you are there attacking them, although this probably wouldn't work on some enemies and in some scenarios. Probably the biggest advantage, though, to a strategy like that is the fact that enemy damage reflection doesn't work with ranged attacks, so a big weakness to Blade and Blunt is that enemies can reflect a lot of damage back at you, which is a huge problem for max difficulty because it's 6 times, right? But the biggest advantage to bows and arrows is that enemy damage reflection doesn't work with ranged attacks. So you could kill tough enemies like Clanfear Runts this way, no problem. The skill is even viable for a high-level character as well, more so than Blade or Blunt, because you can reduce your fatigue down to a single point with potions, and then fortify your fatigue with magic or whatever to deal ridiculously high damage. I have a whole video on this topic, my Marksman guide, but do note that this does not work in the remaster. They changed the damage formula. Can either be just decent and on the same level as like Blade or Blunt probably, or it can be insanely powerful depending on how you approach it. Very good skill, actually. In the remaster, I think it's probably not as good, but you get the idea. Next up is Mercantile. On the surface, this seems alright at best. It's tough to level up, and so your theoretical bonus to buying and selling prices is actually pretty limited. And of course, you don't have to interact with it at all, right? Well, not so fast. Unfortunately, it's another skill that's essentially required to beat the game. Selling is one of the few ways to make gold, and so things like spellmaking and enchanting sort of require that on principle. And even a low-level melee character probably has to buy things like repair hammers, so you could go out of your way to avoid selling, but it would be a lot more work. Buying any spell at all from a spell vendor also gives you skill experience, so at max difficulty, it would be a serious challenge run to actually beat the game without Mercantile. You'd have to find a way to generate gold, which I can think of, basically. There's a few areas in the game where treasure chests will spawn, and you can loot those without really fighting anything. And so there definitely is a way to make it work, probably with alchemy and a few other tricks. Now, buying things doesn't increase your Mercantile, but then, of course, you're limited in terms of what spells you have access to, so that's a pretty big major roadblock. You could maybe do like a melee character and then like somehow get your hands on a bunch of gold or dupe a bunch of repair hammers, and that would probably work just okay. No Mercantile is the kind of challenge run I haven't yet attempted, And even illusion is kind of powerless without it, since you have to buy spell effects for most illusion effects. Another way you could probably do it is to drop your stats with alchemy, and then sneak archery around like I've also done, and that would be another way to do it. In any case, I do think that Mercantile enables so much that I have to put it at the top of S tier. Now, should you take it as a major skill? Probably not. I think for that purpose, it's relatively terrible. But it is also just a fact of life in this game that if you want to cast spells or make gold by selling things, you have to work with Mercantile. And there are reasons to take it as a major. If, for example, you want an expensive item out of a merchant, you need high Mercantile. So I do have to put it in S tier. I can't lie to you. Mercantile is a great skill, but should you be increasing it? No. Okay, next up is Mysticism. This skill has some cool stuff. Detect Life can be somewhat convenient, as it allows you to see enemies move around while sneaking and stuff like that. Unfortunately, that's also pretty easy to get out of alchemy or enchanted items. Dispel also could maybe be useful in some scenarios, as it removes positive and negative spell effects on you, so anything with a duration. That could maybe be used to knock silence or damage spells off of your character in some scenarios. But again, alchemy also has access to that as well. It's also a very expensive spell effect, so probably no good in reality, and I don't think I've ever really used it. You also have telekinesis, which could be used, I guess, to get some random loot pieces like Varla stones, or maybe to steal from NPCs or something like that, so not strictly useless. It also can be used to theoretically get infinite magicka, because you can absorb your own telekinesis spells to restore more magicka than you spent, but it's not actually useful in my opinion. The biggest problem is you need high spell absorption, and also high mysticism skill to get the most out of it. And even then, there are weird rules to it and stuff like that, but it could theoretically be added onto custom spells. I think that requiring high spell absorption is a real deal breaker, unfortunately. If you have 100% spell absorption, you probably don't even really need infinite magicka anyway, as you can apparently farm sigil stones at will, but there probably is some use for it. I won't say it's completely useless, but not something I ever personally found useful. You also get Reflect Damage, Reflect Spell, and Reflect Absorption, so in theory with these three effects you can make yourself mostly immune to damage from either attacks or spells, and then the enemies will also damage themselves by attacking you or casting spells at you. These effects are unfortunately very expensive, so they are pretty cool in theory, but very tough to pull off. You need to fortify your magicka and willpower like crazy with Restoration or enchantments, at which point you could probably get away with nearly anything else as well. A very cool concept for a character, and I did do it, but it's also very impractical. Probably the most actually useful thing Mysticism can do is Soul Trap, so you can not only trap enemy souls, but a Soul Trap spell is also required to make Black Soul Gems, which can hold humanoid souls. But honestly, I don't really like fiddling with Soul Trap either. I think it's really tedious and awful, but it is another avenue you can use to beat the game if you want, and for that it will require Soul Trap, of course. So I'll be polite to Mysticism and give it D tier. It can be used for some things, but it is also an absurdly impractical skill, and even at its best, it is kind of tedious. But a cool skill, not necessarily a good one. Okay, next up is Restoration. This is one of those skills that seems really broken and kind of is. You can restore your health and the health of NPCs. You can fortify your attributes, skills, health, magicka, and fatigue. You can cure disease. You can give yourself resistance to magic, which is an absurdly powerful effect. You can even deal damage through Absorb Health, which drains the enemy's health and gives it to you. But unfortunately, there are two crippling problems with all of this. First off is that it is really expensive to do basically any of it. Some of these spell effects can be cheap, like fortifying your skills or your fatigue, but most of this is going to cost you a ton of magicka to cast even relatively simple spells. It also takes forever to level the skill up. As far as I know, it is the slowest skill in the game to increase. You just about have to buy skill training to make use of it in any kind of realistic sense. With all that being said, you can still fortify your fatigue and your own skills for decently cheap, and that's actually a pretty big deal for a lot of different kinds of characters. You can also go infinite with it and fortify your magicka and willpower into the 1000 range, at which point you can cast whatever spells you like basically, even big huge mysticism spells or absorb health. And I'm somewhat confident you could mostly beat the game with just Restoration. You could heal NPC followers, stay low level, and just let them do all the fighting, and that would probably be a way you could do things. The issue would be Paradise at the end of the game. You need to somehow get through the entire end of the game like that, but it's maybe doable. So there is a lot of power in this skill actually, but it's so inconvenient that I have rarely if ever used it. It really is just too impractical, in my opinion, to actually be useful in most cases, but there are plenty of scenarios where I've healed my character up using the spell just to save a little bit of time, or maybe in like a pinch or something. So I'll give it C tier. It's definitely not useless, but it's also not a skill I've used particularly extensively, but very, very much dragged down by its expensiveness and how hard it is to level. Okay, next is security. This skill governs the lockpicking minigame to open locks. I like the minigame itself, it is kind of fun, and one good thing about this skill is that as long as you know how to do it, your security skill doesn't really matter. It's also really good for some quests, and I think sometimes even required, for like the Thieves Guild or the Dark Brotherhood quest lines. And of course, it can also help you get some decent loot, most notably high-quality soul gems from the Coral Mages Guild at level 1, for example. Unfortunately, that's about the extent of it. Oblivion loot in general can be pretty poor unless you are very high level. Getting anything decent is kind of a needle in a haystack. Even worse, Alteration can be used to open the overwhelming majority of the locks in the game, although you will require a custom spell to open locks at the very hard level, but that only requires an Alteration of 75, so it's really not impossible to do. The game also has 2 greater powers with open effects as well, so you can get a Burst Sign which lets you open average locks, and you can get a Burst Sign Stone power that allows you to open a hard lock once per day. In plenty of cases, keys can also be pickpocketed off of NPCs as well, especially during quests, so there's another reason not to use it. All in all though, as long as you know how to use it, it's still more convenient than any of those other things in my opinion, which is nice. And all you really have to do is watch for the pins to move up slowly, and you don't need any investment in it at all, as long as you have enough lockpicks every time you kind of goof up. So I'll give it C tier. It is kind of broadly unnecessary in the overwhelming majority of scenarios, but it does help with some stuff, and that does count for something. Okay, next is Sneak. This skill governs sneaking and your ability to avoid detection while sneaking. Sneaking also allows you to perform sneak attacks for 2 to 6 times bonus damage, as long as you aren't being detected. So while sneaking is a bit outclassed by Chameleon, a character relying on that still has to be sneaking to get the bonus damage, which can make the difference in some cases. Similarly, any amount of Chameleon helps sneak, up to and including 100% Chameleon, at which point enemies are simply incapable of detecting you in most cases. But Chameleon isn't necessary at all. If you pay attention to things like lighting and enemy line of sight, you can sneak your way through tons of quests, and especially for a low-level character, you absolutely can successfully kill lots of enemies with sneak attacks, even melee sneak attacks, as they sometimes won't even be able to detect you while they're being attacked, if of course you attack them from behind, in low lighting, and things like that. There is also a way to level it up really fast, by attempting to pickpocket a prisoner over and over again. It doesn't really synergize with spellcasting though, as casting a spell emits light, and enemies can see that light, not to mention of course that your destruction spells don't benefit from sneak attack bonuses either. It's a very underrated skill however, and surprisingly strong in plenty of scenarios. You can use it to do things like sneak through Oblivion gates as long as you're really careful and you have 100 sneak. That's actually pretty cool. Very solid B tier skill. It's only let down by the fact it can't do anything and everything for you. There are going to be limits to its power, but it is very strong when it is strong. Okay, and lastly we have Speechcraft. This allows you to do the Speechcraft minigame, which can be used to increase NPC disposition. Not bad or anything, can be useful for some quests or to haggle with merchants. Unfortunately, disposition can be easily gained by simply bribing NPCs. Even worse, illusion can also be easily used to increase NPC disposition as well, to the point where it is entirely outclassed. And it levels up really slowly too, comedically slowly, so it's tough to even gain any kind of value out of it. If it leveled up decently fast, it would at least get points for being kind of fun, but as it is prohibitively difficult to achieve an endgame scenario with it where you can charm any NPC up to max disposition or something like that. I kind of wish it had some sort of unique bonus where you could haggle your prices even more or something like that, but unfortunately it just doesn't. There are also scenarios where it can't even be used against certain NPCs, like you'll encounter a bandit on the road and you'd think maybe you could speechcraft your way out of it, but you can't. Or, stuff like that where it's like this just isn't Fallout New Vegas, you just can't really use it for anything in a lot of cases. I do think that it probably is better than hand-to-hand, because at least it does something, which I think says more about hand-to-hand than it does about speechcraft. That's how bad hand-to-hand is that it's actually worse than speechcraft. That's crazy, honestly. But it does at least have a use, even if that use is nothing more than saving you like 10 gold on a merchant, or helping you complete a quest without having to cast a spell or give the NPC a bunch of gold, but very much an F tier skill. Okay, so we'll do a quick recap here to explain the tier list, and we'll go into a lot of detail because skills do matter a lot. S tier is either the mandatory skills you basically have to use, or skills that are clear and obviously head and shoulders above others. Illusion and Alchemy being overwhelmingly powerful and extremely versatile. These give you all kinds of unique and powerful ways to kill or even just ignore enemies if you want, not to mention they enable all kinds of crazy spellcasting. And Mercantile and Athletics are basically required to beat the game in a lot of ways. You can take them for granted if you want, but it would be a lot of very specific work to not use either of those two skills, since Mercantile is tied to selling items and buying spells, and Athletics is tied to running and swimming. So those I also think belong in S tier. A tier is for very strong skills, but with serious flaws or meaningful downsides, but also can have a very broad and extreme impact on how you play the game. Marksman can be elevated to extreme power by reducing your maximum fatigue to 1, at least in the original game, not the remaster. Otherwise, it's an average skill with some unique uses. Conjuration is a very powerful skill, but it can be a pain to use against some enemies, and isn't enough on its own to beat the game with. Destruction is also very powerful, and stacking weakness spells can be strong, including by enchanting a weapon. Unfortunately, enemies with spell reflection are a serious issue, and it really shines with the support of other skills. Alteration can pick locks and make you largely immune to physical attacks, and it's easy to use, but it can't really do any more than that. B tier is for skills that are pretty good and help enable other skills. Armor is necessary for nearly any armor or weapon-based character, and is a good skill to be leveling for this reason. Block can be used to seriously reduce incoming physical damage, and it's decently quick to level. Heavy armor is a great way to get tons of defenses for essentially free, and armor, block, and heavy armor can all help increase your endurance stat, which is good for a character if you plan to level up with them. Sneak can also be very useful for evading enemies and getting free bonus damage for no real effort, but only sometimes. It doesn't work all the time. C tier is for skills that are potentially very good, but have serious flaws, so they can work, but they are usually more effort than the skills in the higher tiers. Blade has some unique weapons at your disposal, and it can be decently viable, as well as some of the best weapons for enchanting. Acrobatics is nearly one of those skills that you just have to use because it's tied to jumping, but it's pretty easy to go without jumping actually, and so it ends up being kind of middling. It can of course help you skip some stuff, or help you move around faster, which does make it nice, for that at least. Restoration is really powerful and can do some very crazy things, but it's also probably the worst skill in the game to level up, other than maybe like Speechcraft. And honestly, it's not even that useful for healing compared to Alchemy, or even just potions you can find or buy from merchants. Light armor is a decent skill to give you some extra defenses, but generally outclassed by heavy armor, except that it is lighter. And then security has some uses, it's convenient, but unless you're doing the Thieves Guild questline, it's really not necessary at all, because Oblivion loot is kind of bad. D tier are skills that are quite flawed, but may have some extremely niche or minimal uses. Blunt is okay in lieu of Blade or Marksman, but offers few if any real advantages over those skills. Mysticism has some theoretically potent spells, but you are going really far out of your way to even make use of it. It does have Soul Trap, although that's more work than it really is worth in a lot of cases. Unless, of course, you are relying very heavily on enchantments, which I think is kind of tedious. Now, F tier is the worst of the worst. Skills that are completely useless and outclassed. Speechcraft basically does nothing, as NPC disposition barely matters, honestly, and NPCs can be bribed anyway, so it's just nearly completely worthless. Hand-to-hand is my vote for the single worst skill in Oblivion, and a roleplay gimmick more than any other skill. Absolutely pathetic damage, completely outclassed by every other skill in the game, most of which have at least some niche applications. Hand-to-hand has absolutely none. It's purely a gimmick. The ability to knock enemies down isn't even really good, and realistically you need the support of magic to really make that mean something, at which point, if you're casting spells, you could do damage in any other way than hand-to-hand. There are ways to make hand-to-hand work, but hand-to-hand is doing none of the heavy lifting. Hand-to-hand is purely along for the ride, basically, except for the fact that you do still have to deal damage. Obviously, skills are really important for Oblivion, so it makes sense to be as thorough as possible, and I think the skill system is actually pretty well balanced overall, and it actually can be kind of tough to rate. Since by design, no skill is ever really supposed to be able to stand on its own, you really are supposed to use a mix of skills to beat the game, so that makes analysis a little bit trickier, but I do stand by these rankings, even if I suspect some people will raise some eyebrows at some of these rankings, like maybe armor is A tier or something, or maybe block is A tier, or you can make the argument that conjuration and destruction deserve a higher placement. I disagree, but you at least kind of see why I have conjuration and destruction in A tier and stuff like that. Next, I'd like to give a special shout out to the Old Knight, Kiss Hairseg, and Schneller Herring. These three people from YouTube taught me a huge amount about Oblivion, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to kind of build on that knowledge and contribute to the knowledge base about the game Oblivion, as well as the UESP and fandom wikis. Without these two sources, none of this would be possible at all, and so I do have to give a special shout out to them. And lastly, if you like this video, please consider liking, commenting, and subscribing, and thank you very much for watching.